All right. All right. So, at the end of last week, we were looking at plant and animal responses to begin our ecological discussion. And today, we're going to move forward to talk about how energy flows in an ecosystem. So, um, when we're studying ecology, for our last major unit of the year, there's different levels that we can approach the topic on, depending on uh, what scale of interactions do we want to study? So looking at ecology is always about studying interactions. Okay, so we can study interactions from the organism level, from the population level, which is a group of organisms of the same species, a community level, which now includes a variety of different populations, from the ecosystem level, which includes different communities as well as the non-living aspects of their environment, and from what's called the biosphere, or the whole thin layer of the earth that can support life. Specifically today, we're going to start kind of at the top, and we're going to look at some things in ecosystems, mainly how energy flows and moves in an ecosystem. So, some essential questions for today. What limits how much a given ecosystem can produce? What limits the production in an ecosystem? How do nutrients move in the ecosystem? And how does energy move through the ecosystem? So an ecosystem is all the organisms in a community plus the abiotic factors. And abiotic factors are just non-living parts of the environment. So we're talking about all the living and the living not all the living and the non-living components of the environment. So here in this little glass terrarium, we have the plants, but also the dirt, the soil, and the water and the rocks. Those are examples of abiotic factors, so we're including those. And ecosystems transform energy from one state to the other. And they're self-sustaining. That's why if you've ever seen like a bottle terrarium, or maybe in a more familiar context, the uh, bottle assignment that you did at the very beginning of the year in your freshman year, if you remember that, um, that was an attempt at making a self-sufficient ecosystem. The ecosystem, in order to be self-sufficient, needs to capture energy, to transfer that energy, and to cycle nutrients. And so we're going to talk about how those three things are accomplished. So in every ecosystem, we have a constant input of energy from the sun. We go back, that is the main way that energy is captured in an ecosystem. It starts in the plants that capture sunlight energy through photosynthesis. The last thing they talked about was cycle nutrients, and we have what's called the biogeochemical cycles, like the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and things like that, to cycle nutrients. And then we also have um, the energy that's being transferred from one organism to the other. When a herbivore eats a plant, it gains the energy in the plant. And when a carnivore eats the herbivore, it takes on that energy in the herbivore. So energy is able to cycle throughout the ecosystem. This is a generalized nutrient cycle, so it is a general template that we can put on all of the specific nutrient cycles. And this is kind of how it looks. So um, if we are going to think about some nutrient, maybe like, I don't know, carbon, It might start in an abiotic reservoir. That just means a non-living storage place, like dirt, like the carbon in dirt. Or it might start in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, and it would enter our food chain by being absorbed into plants. And then producers, plants, absorb the carbon dioxide, and consumers, herbivores, eat the plants and take on the carbon, and more consumers eat the other consumers until these organisms die and decomposers like bacteria and mushrooms return that carbon to maybe the atmosphere or maybe the soil. And at the same time, that carbon in the soil and the atmosphere is very slowly being cycled with a geological process. So, for example, carbon can be turned into, be lithified and turned into coal or into oil. All right. And so this happens very slowly, the cycle from the abiotic reservoir to a geological process. But this is a general way we can think of a nutrient cycle. Here is specifically the carbon cycle, where CO2 is in the atmosphere, that is in its abiotic reservoir, like we talked about. Photosynthesis is used to transform that carbon into plants. And plants and animals will return that carbon back to the atmosphere through respiration, cellular respiration. Enters the food chain through photosynthesis, and is returned to the abiotic reservoir through combustion or respiration. So let's just take a look at this picture again. I know this seems pretty simple, but it's just good to have a general idea of how this works. Don't forget also that dissolved carbon dioxide is in seawater, and it can go to the fish and the plants and the algae, but it also can be turned into sediment and carbonates, shells, and then dissolve back in the water. That's an interplay between the water and an abiotic reservoir in the lake. We also have the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen is super important for making protein. And so there's a nitrogen cycle, and you can kind of see it here, how nitrogen in the atmosphere uh, can be taken from the abiotic reservoir and turned into something that's available to living organisms through what's called nitrogen fixation. So nitrogen as N2 gas can't be utilized immediately by living organisms, right? That's why the atmosphere is like 72% nitrogen, but we can't just breathe in the nitrogen and get all that we need. It needs to be fixed or turned into usable nitrogen in like nitrates. And bacteria do a lot of that nitrogen fixation so that animals can, or plants can absorb it, and then animals can eat it. And here you can see how nitrogen is taken from the abiotic reservoir, okay? How it is returned to the soil, the abiotic reservoir, right? And how it's cycling between living organisms. And you can kind of see right there. We're not going to talk as much about the phosphorus cycle. It also cycles very similar to like carbon and nitrogen. It's not as important for us to go through thoroughly. I was just going to put it up here so that you can see how similar it is to the ones that we've been talking about. But lastly, the water cycle, probably the one we know the most about. Uh, song maybe we learned in kindergarten or first grade about the different parts of the water cycle. And just knowing that water is crucial for all life that we know of. So this one is really at the crux of maintaining biological interactions. Um, but even small changes in the water cycle can drastically affect um, the stability of life in a specific ecosystem. Transpiration in plants, which is the loss of water through the leaves, is really important in the maintenance of an ecosystem. As you can see here, the evaporation or transpiration of water through leaves helps to pull water up through a tree from the ground. The air has the most negative water potential, and the water potential becomes more positive as you move down to the tree into the soil. So, uh, this evaporation kind of instigates a chain or an elevator, a column of water being pulled up through the tree and out. Deforestation breaks the water cycle because groundwater is not being able to be transpired in the atmosphere, so precipitation is not uh, a result, and that is one of the main causes of desertification. Clear cutting and cutting down trees breaks the water cycle and kills the ecosystem surrounding it. The Green Belt movement, especially popular in Kenya, has been having a main goal of restoring a sustainable ecosystem to a lot of places that have suffered desertification, and it is is super important in establishing democracy and empowering women within the communities that help perpetuate the movement, which are extremely important social causes, while at the same time giving back to an ecosystem or repairing an ecosystem that's vitally important for the region. Um, we can look a little bit more at deforestation. So when deforestation happens, so when we clear cut those trees to make more rooms for homes and subdivisions and things like that, uh, one, water loss increases, kind of as you can see here, but also nitrates in the runoff, the level of nitrogen drastically increases, kind of you can see right here of this line with the concentration of nitrates just skyrockets. And those nitrates, like we said, are necessary for life in that ecosystem. And if they're being lost, being carried away in the runoff, then we're breaking again the nitrogen cycle, and the diversity of animals can't really be maintained. So deforestation not only breaks the uh, water cycle, but also these nutrient cycles, as we can see here. Lastly, we're just going to talk about generally the flow of energy through an ecosystem and how ultimately all energy begins with the sun, and that it is manifested in a biochemical form in plants and produces via photosynthesis. Primary consumers or herbivores eat the plants and are then eaten by secondary and tertiary consumers on through what's called the food chain. What's important to notice is that each level in what we call this a trophic pyramid, so you can think of like the producers at the bottom forms a pyramid. At each level, energy is being lost due to the inefficiency of converting energy from one form to the other. So producers contain the most amount of energy, and each level loses energy as we go. So for example, that's why like if you have a cow, which is a primary consumer of herbivore, right? It takes about 10 pounds of grass producers for every 1 pound of cow because of this energy inefficiency. And that energy inefficiency becomes even less as you get towards the top. So that's why it takes so much land to raise cattle and why meat is so expensive. So if you think about one of the really sustainable ways that you could contribute to preserving the environment is maybe possibly having less of reliance personally on utilizing those things higher up the trophic pyramid because it's more resource intensive to be able to raise those animals. So here again we have a food chain with the different trophic levels, level 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we also have the decomposers here at the bottom, right? We call anything like level 4, 3, 2, the consumers, we call them heterotrophs because they need to eat other organisms, either other animals or plants, to gain energy. And we call producers autotrophs. They don't need to eat other organisms to get energy. They just get their energy directly from sunlight. There's the sun. Now, we talked about how energy is not efficiently transferred from one level to the other. There's a loss of energy between levels of the food chain. Look at it. All the energy that this bug gets from eating this leaf, about 50% goes to waste, just isn't utilized at all, and about a third of it is used in cellular respiration. Only about 17% goes in actual growth of this beetle. So that's very inefficient. This is all of that energy that's being lost at each level of the trophic diagram. So again, like we were talking about, here's our ecological pyramid, our trophic levels. And we see, and this is important, as we go from one trophic level to the next, there's a tenfold loss in energy. Go back here. About tenfold loss in energy. Okay? That's why there are, as we go up the food chain, there are fewer of each organisms in those trophic levels than the one beneath it. That. And that's where we're going to end today.